I've never had Vietnamese coffee. I'm making this video having never tasted a local Vietnamese coffee, and I think that is the central argument of this whole story. That is the point. When majority of us think about coffee, we don't think about Vietnamese coffee, if you will. We think of Brazil, Colombia, Ethiopia, Italy, Yemen, places like that, These are countries that have made their coffee culture visible and marketable to the outside world. We all know where an espresso or a mocha comes from, but Vietnam doesn't market itself enough in that particular relation. But here are some statistics that's going to change your mind about coffee and Vietnam, if you will. Vietnam is the second largest coffee producer on earth, after Brazil, ahead of Colombia, Ethiopia, and Indonesia. If I asked my 12-year-old nephew where Vietnam is, he won't be able to probably point it to the mark on a map with its relation to the neighbors. That country produces more coffee than almost anyone else on earth. And 97% of what Vietnam produces is Robusta, which is the bean that goes into almost every instant coffee ever made. So think of Nescafé or every cheap supermarket blend that you've ever had, or the coffee machine that you use on a daily basis on your work. It's basically the coffee that the world is running on without actually knowing where it's coming from. Vietnam produces 40% of the world's entire Robusta supply. You have almost certainly drunk Vietnamese coffee without knowing it. Most of the world has. Coffee arrived in Vietnam in 1857. A French Catholic missionary brought a single Arabica tree to the northern region, not as a gift but as a test. Now this is a time where French had just begun asserting control over Southeast Asia, and it was looking for crops that could make its colonies profitable. And that plant, it thrived. Vietnam's Central Highlands, which is the region of red volcanic soil, it has a high altitude and a reliable rainfall rate, turned out to be almost perfectly suited for coffee cultivation, to the point that by the late 1800s, plantations were spreading across the highlands, and by the early 20th century, Vietnam had become a significant producer of coffee within the French colonial system. The coffee was not grown for Vietnamese people, it was grown for European markets. The labor was extracted from the land and the people on it. The profits left the country, and this is basically how colonialism works in agriculture anywhere. You take the land, you take the labor, and then you take the crop. And when you eventually leave or kicked out, you leave behind the plant the soil knowledge and the market infrastructure that was never designed for the people who remained. Then came a disease that changed everything in the 1890s. Coffee rust, or what it's called here, which I cannot pronounce, arrives in Vietnam. By 1957, Arabica's share of Vietnamese production had collapsed from 64.5% to just 1.7%. It seemed like the French had planted the wrong bean for the long term. But around 1908, the French were also fiddling around with the second variety of coffee at the Central Highlands, Robusta, brought from Congo via Indonesia. It was hardier, it had higher yield, and it was resistant to the rust that was killing Arabica. And it turned out to love the specific conditions of Vietnamese highlands in a way that produced something quite unique. A deeper, earthier, more intensely caffeinated bean than what the rest of the world was used to. The French had made a practical decision in a specific agricultural crisis. They couldn't have known they were handing Vietnam the raw material for an economic miracle 50 years later. When France was finally expelled in 1954, after 8 years of war, it left all the required resources and ingredients to create a massive coffee industry that the world would eventually discover it could not do without. But then you have this. The Vietnam War ended in 1975. The Central Highlands, which was the heart of this coffee country, had been one of the most heavily bombed and contested regions in the entire conflict. Plantations were destroyed, infrastructure was gone, The country's economy had been effectively dismantled by 20 years of continuous warfare. In 1986, the total area of Vietnam dedicated to coffee cultivation was just 50,000 hectares. Production was around 18,400 tons. To give you the context, that is a fraction of what a mid-sized coffee producer manages in a normal year. And then came Doi Moi. Doi Moi, which translates to renovation, was the name Vietnam gave to its economic reform program launched in 1986. It opened the country to private enterprise and foreign investment for the first time since reunification. It allowed farmers to own and profit from their own land and remove the state control that had been staggering agricultural output. The government actively encouraged migration into the Central Highlands, offering land, seedlings, and infrastructure to farmers willing to relocate from the overcrowded lowlands and develop the highlands for agriculture. Between 4 and 5 million people migrated to the region in the decade after 1975. The effect was almost immediate and almost unbelievable, to be honest. Roughly a decade after Doi Moi, Vietnam had overtaken Colombia to become the world's second largest coffee exporter. It went from producing 18,000 tons of coffee in 1986 to producing millions of tons by the end of the century. Today, approximately 3 million Vietnamese citizens depend directly on coffee industry for their livelihood. Vietnam, under duress, took a single most important decision to rebuild itself by growing Robusta coffee in the Central Highlands, and it bloody well worked. Here's what I find strange about Vietnam's relationship with coffee. It produces the coffee the world drinks without thinking about it. It's at an industrial scale, if you will. Robusta, for instance, is a blend for commercial espresso, and Vietnam feeds the volume market with it. And then, on the contrary, you have coffee like this. The fin is a small metal drip filter that sits on the top of the glass. The coffee grounds go in, hot water goes on top, and then you simply wait. The coffee falls through drop by drop on its own time. It's a bloody slow process, to be honest, but you just wait because the fruit is nice. Now, in all honesty, Fin's origin traces back to the French colonial drip brewing equipment, a gravity-fed drip pod the French brought to their colonies in the 19th century. Now, what the Vietnamese people did with it is they simplified the process. They made it single serving, stripped away everything that was not essential, and designed specifically around the deep concentrated flavor of Robusta. The result was a tool that looks adopted but functions as something original. The coffee that came out of it was a thick, dark, and intensely strong one. By the way, Robusta has nearly double the caffeine of Arabica. So Vietnamese people often drink it with sweetened condensed milk, which the French introduced during the colonization and which the Vietnamese adopted entirely as their own. Iced coffee with condensed milk has become one of the most distinctive drinks in the world for anyone who has tried it. But here's something that is quite exquisite that needs mentioning here. Egg coffee. Yep. In 1946, Hanoi was at war. It was the first Indochina war against the French, who basically wanted their colonies back. The city was under pressure, basic supplies were running short. At the Sofitel Legend Metropole Hotel, a bartender named Nguyen Van Giong, I hope this is the right pronunciation, I'm sorry if it's not, faces a specific problem. The hotel was running out of milk and the guests still wanted their coffee. So Jiang looked at what he had basically. Eggs, condensed milk, coffee, and that's about it. He whisked the egg yolk with sugar and condensed milk until it became a dense, creamy foam, and then pours it with a Fin-brewed coffee below it. And the guests loved it. He eventually leaves the hotel and opens his own shop called Café Jiang in Hanoi's Old Quarter. By the way, his son still runs it today. The recipe, which includes butter and cheese alongside the egg and condensed milk, remains somewhat of a secret. Now, Safi Tung, the egg coffee, I hope I'm pronouncing it right again, was invented in a colonial hotel during a war of independence by a Vietnamese man who took French ingredients and made something that had never existed before. Now, after looking into the documents for a while, one word keeps coming back when I think about Vietnamese coffee. It is reclamation. The French brought the plant, they built the plantation system, they extracted the labor and the crop and the profit. And when they left, Vietnam was left with the soil, the knowledge, and the Robusta beans that the world was gonna need on a daily basis. What Vietnam did with that inheritance is one of the most remarkable economic stories of 20th century, at least for coffee. A war-destroyed country starting with near zero built itself into the second largest coffee producer on earth within a single generation through farmers in a Central Highlands growing a bean that nobody in the specialty coffee world was paying much attention to. And while it was doing all of that, it was also sitting on plastic chairs on Hanoi's pavements waiting for the fin to drip, drinking egg coffee invented during a war with whisked egg yolks because there was no milk. The country that supplies the world's most impatient coffee consumers brews its own coffee in the most unhurried way imaginable. For the Vietnamese, coffee is not a commodity they happen to produce. It is a daily ritual, a social anchor, a philosophical space that belongs to them in a way that cannot be exported or scaled or bottled for a supermarket shelf in another country. Sitting here right now, I haven't tried it yet. My location doesn't have a Vietnamese coffee shop that could do justice to the coffee, but I intend to fix that, not by ordering something approximating it online, but by going there. One day at least. Sitting on one of those plastic chairs, watching the fin drip, waiting the way the culture says you should wait. Until then, this video is made out of love for coffee culture that the mainstream conversation has almost entirely ignored, and a belief that the most interesting stories that are usually in places nobody thought to look. If you're still here, thank you for watching the video. I hope you liked it. Drop a comment of what you think about it, and if you're into coffee and the stories that I'm telling in this series, you might want to check this out. This is the introduction to coffee and how it spread around the world, and then you might want to watch this, which is coffee in Japan. And I hope you like it. I'll see you in the next video. Ciao ciao.